In this lecture, we are going to continue our exploration of ancient Greece, looking at chapter 5 from your textbook. And so we're going to pick up this time with the early and high classical periods. Now, the classical age began from the defeat of the Persian invaders. And what happens is actually the different Greek city-states unified, and it was a unified force of the Hellenic city-states, and they were able to defeat the Persians. For a time, though, it seemed as if the Persians would overtake all of Greece, and so this victory was very decisive and it was very important for the Greek people. And basically, the Greeks saw it as a narrow escape from domination by the Asian barbarians. And then this nurtured a sense of Hellenic pride and identity, and from then on, Europe would be seen as distinct from Asia. The playwright Aeschylus, circa 525 to 456 BCE, he celebrated this triumph of reason and law over barbarous crimes, blood feuds, and mad vengeance in his trilogy of plays called the Oresteia. This is usually considered the high point of Greek civilization. It was the time of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, all famous playwrights, Herodotus, the historian, Pericles, the statesman, and Socrates, the very famous Athenian philosopher. Now, during this time, architecture and architectural sculpture was very important. And the first great work of classic art and architecture is the Temple of Zeus at Olympia. This was the site of the Olympic Games. It is in ruins now, but it actually looks much like the Temple of Hera too, and that's actually what's pictured in your textbook. The architect was Liban of Elis, and construction began in 470 and was completed by 457 BCE. Now, the Temple of Zeus was very lavishly decorated. The statues filled both pediments. Remember, the pediments are the triangular shapes. And narrative relief sculptures adorned 6 metopes over the doorway of the pronaos, and there were 6 more in the ospitamos. And so you can see this was a very, very highly decorated work. Now, what happens in here is the metopes depict the 12 labors of Heracles. Remember, we've already mentioned Heracles is the Greek name, and then Hercules is the Roman name. Hera, Zeus's wife, hated Heracles and made him go mad and kill his wife and children. As punishment, he had to perform 12 great labors, including the slaying of the lion Numa. After he did this, he then wore the skin. So the skin, the lion skin, and his Heracles club would be his attributes. And we'll see that a little bit later in some of the works. You'll see he's depicted with the skin and the club often. After he finished these 12 labors, no one actually thought he would be able to do it, but he did. He was then awarded immortality. In the east pediment of the Temple of Zeus is a chariot race between Pelops and King Oenomaus. It's a very dark story. You can read in your text the story behind it. But an interesting point is that it actually faced toward the starting point of all Olympic chariot races. All the figures are posed as if they were actors on a stage, except for the old seer, who I have you shown in detail here. The top image is the reconstruction of the pediment. You can see the seer is actually third from the right, and then here is a close-up of the seer. Now, this actually is a rare depiction of old age. He's shown as balding, he's got wrinkles on his head, and the sagging muscles. And we see here the show of true emotion, no archaic smile. He's actually shocked. He's got this shocked expression over what he knows to come. And again, this is a reflection of the dark story from this chariot race. Now, we won't actually see this much emotion again until we get to the Hellenistic age, which is at the end of the chapter. Most everyone here is shown with quietly and with a serene dignity, and because of that, art historians actually call this early classical phase the severe style. Continuing looking at statuary, early classical statuary is the abandonment of the rigid and unnatural Egyptian-inspired poses of the archaic statues. And so the image we have on the left here, this is called Critios Boy, circa 480 BCE, and it is marble and 3 feet 10 inches high. Now, it's called this because it once was thought it was created by the sculptor Critios, but that has been disproved. Now, this is actually one of the most important statues in art history. Why? Because it portrays how humans actually stand. Think back to, the Egyptian statues that we looked at, very rigid, very frontal facing. Same with the archaic statues that were inspired by this. That's not how we as humans stand. And this work shows how humans actually stand. It's this shifting of weight. And as we have this shifting of weight, there is a harmonious, smooth motion of all the body parts. This is not as rigid and not fully frontal. Here we see the youth dips his right hip slightly to the right, indicating the shifting of weight onto his left leg. In fact, the right leg is bent, meaning it's at ease. The head is turned slightly to the right and tilted. And this shift in weight is what separates classical from archaic Greek statuary. That is rigid, literally, so we're seeing a shifting from one style to the other. Another example of this is the image on the right, and this is the Rheac bronzes. This is one of them. Circa 460 to 450 BCE, 6 feet 6 inches high. And these bronzes were actually 2 statues that were found in the cargo of a ship that sank in antiquity off the coast of Race, Italy, which is kind of like the toe of the boot. And this was a pair of warriors. And they were cast, they're what's called the hollow cast bronze, and that's what that interior image is. Make sure you do read that sidebar talking about hollow cast bronzing or hollow casting. And here, though, again, hollow cast bronze with silver inlaid eyes, teeth, and eyelashes, copper nipples and mouth. Now, it is missing the helmet, sword, and shield, but again, you can see here when you look at the stance, the shift in weight is even more pronounced. The head's turned more to the right, and the shoulders tilt and the hips swing more markedly than the Critios boy. Arms have also been freed from the body, that they aren't that rigid, stuck right beside it. And so this shows a much more natural motion in space, much more like how we as humans do move. Other examples of this, on the left, we have the Artemisan Zeus or Poseidon, we're really not sure, circa 460 to 450 BCE. It is a bronze and is 6 feet 10 inches high. Again, we're not sure if it's Zeus or Poseidon. Most people believe it's Zeus, but you can see he's getting ready to throw something. Whatever was in his hand would have let us know who it was, so the attribute. So if it was a lightning bolt, we would know it was Zeus. If it was a trident, we would know it was Poseidon. Interestingly enough, this was also found in a shipwreck. But here what's more important is we see that male form in motion, right? He's getting ready to throw. You can see the arms are extended. The right heel is off the ground. So literally he's getting ready to shift his weight forward to throw the spear, the lightning bolt, whatever was in his hands. Again, we see this idealized human form being shown, but the importance again here is it's showing it in motion. That's the same for the middle image here. This is the Discopolis, or the discus thrower. This was created by Myron circa 450 BCE. It is marble, 5 feet 1 inches. Now, this is going to be one of our examples. The original was a bronze, however, it has been lost. And what we have left are these copies that were made during Roman times. So this one is marble, but the original was bronze. However, what you're going to see here is this vigorous action in the statue. We have this poised body showing the coiled tension right before he throws. So the discus thrower, right? He's at that moment. He's at that high arch, and just like Zeus was getting ready to throw the spear. Here we've got him ready to, swing around and release the disc. And actually it forms two arches that cross. We've got one from the disc to the left hand, and then one from the head to the right knee. And so these two arches cross and actually helps give this impression of, we're about to see the movement. It's this impression of this tightly stretched bow a moment before the archer releases it. Also, the head is turned away from the viewer. And this is not posing for the viewer, right? This isn't as staged, but the discus thrower is concentrating at the task at hand. We're just happening to capture him in this moment. Now you're also going to see there's kind of a tree trunk there. This was something that structurally had to be added when we had these copies, because if that wasn't there, this statue, since it's made of marble, would be very top heavy and it would fall over. So that's why sometimes these copies of Greek works would have these added structural elements to it that we're pretty sure were not part of the original work. All right, and then the last sculpture that we're looking at on this slide is the Dorophoros, or the spear bearer. This was made by Polyclitus circa 440 BCE. And again, this is a marble copy of the bronze original. Now, Polyclitus believed that to create a perfect statue, there must be harmonious numerical ratios, meaning to begin the work according to an all-encompassing mathematical formula. And he said, this work is an example of the result of that. It's showing the ideal statue of a nude athlete or warrior. Here again, that weight shift is even more pronounced, and this is shown through what we call contrapposto, meaning counterbalance. So the weight is on one leg and the other is at rest. Here the weight is on the front right leg and the left is at rest. So you can see he's literally looks like he's almost stepping forward, and that left leg is bent, right? That there's not pressure on it. The head turns to the right, while the hips twist slightly to the left. And all of this achieves this asymmetrical balance. So the body, interesting enough, it's both in motion and at rest at the same time. And we see this harmony of opposites within the work. Okay, now we're going to move on to the Athenian Acropolis. Probably one of the most well-known images when we think of Greece. The Acropolis is often what is shown. Now, this actually, reconstruction of the Acropolis in Athens started after the Persians sacked it. So after the war, Athens became the dominant force in Greece. Now, what's interesting, I already said that they were able to defeat the Persians because of this alliance of the city-states. And what happens is from that, they actually formed what's called the Delian League. And this was formed in 478 BCE. And the idea was to protect Greece from future attacks from the east. Eventually, Athens takes the lead, and they got even to the point where they decided who would supply ships and who would pay a tribute. In 454 BCE, the treasury of the League was actually transferred to Athens for security reasons. However, it seemed more likely that the Athenian people just wanted the money. And actually, Pericles, who was the leader of Athens at the time, his dates are circa 495 to 429 BCE, he actually took these funds and he used them not for the League, not for protection, but to rebuild the Acropolis in Athens. Many people were angered by this, obviously, and they saw that using the funds for the beautification of Athens and not what it was intended for, meaning the protection of, Greece. Something to keep in mind, right? We are examining this scene that's, the greatness of Greece was actually constructed because of, political corruption, if you will. On the left, this is actually a portrait of Pericles. It's by Praxiteles, circa 429 BCE. And again, this is a Roman marble copy of the head. The whole sculpture had been full body ones, and it was bronze. This is actually what we can also call a herm, which is a sculpted head that sits on a square pillar. Now again, the original was a large full-bodied bronze work. And he is wearing the helmet that tells his rank. This is the rank of a general, and this was a position he was actually held 15 times. He was elected for it 15 different times. Now, this is not what we would consider a traditional portrait in that it captures what he looks like, but it shows him more in this ideal form. Pliny asserted that Crealis had the ability to make noble men appear even more noble in their portraits. And again, this adheres to more of those classical ideas of beauty. In fact, Pliny calls this the Olympic Pericles because he says it makes Pericles almost godlike. And then moving on to the Parthenon, or to the Acropolis, it's made up of the Parthenon, which is the marble building dedicated to Athena. Now, it did not have a priestess or an altar, so it wasn't a traditional temple. Construction began in 447 BCE and was completed by 438 BCE. However, the work on the sculptural ornamentation continued until 432 BCE. We also have the propylaea, which is the stairway, the main stairway leading up, and this was the only way to enter the Acropolis. We have two later temples, the Erechtheion and the Temple of Athena Nike. Now, these were both built after Pericles' death, but they were part of the original plan. Interestingly enough, during the Middle Ages, this area was one time a Byzantine and later a Roman Catholic church, and at one point with the Ottoman Empire, it was even a mosque. Every time it was taken over, it was remodeled. In 1968, the Venetians besieged the Acropolis, and they tried to remove some of the statues in the pediments, and unfortunately they dropped some of them and shattered several. Also, at one point, there was explosives there, and during a battle, an explosion actually blew out the building center. In 1801 to 1803, Thomas Bruce, who was a European, he was the Lord Elgin, he actually brought most of the surviving sculptures to England, and since then they have been on exhibit in London's British Museum. Now, Greece has asked several times to have these returned. However, as of now, England refuses, and so there have been battles over who should actually own them. And because of this, since Thomas Bruce was Lord Elgin, these have become known as the Elgin marbles. And today, the Acropolis still faces destruction. Corrosive emissions of factories and automobiles are actually decomposing the ancient marbles. All right, so we're going to start with a closer look at the Parthenon. The architect of the Parthenon was Epidauros, and Phidias constructed the statue of Athena inside. You can see that this is a recreation of it on the right. And Phidias also oversaw all the temple's sculptural decoration. The structure is the ideal solution to the Greek architect's quest for perfect proportions. However, what's so interesting, right? The Parthenon, we look at it as representing the greatness of Greece and the ideas of this period, of early classical period. Harmony, right? The ratios, that reflects what the Athenian society also valued. But what's interesting is it's actually an optical illusion. There are hardly no straight lines in the Parthenon itself. It's made of a bunch of curving lines, but it's done this way so that it appears to the eye to be perfectly straight. In fact, if you were standing along the lengthwise, if you were standing at one end and I was standing at the other, we would not be able to see each other's feet because there's a slight curve. However, that was done intentionally because from a distance with that slight curve, the human eye still perceives it as a straight line. Because of this, almost every single piece within the Parthenon was individually created. And so a scholar who's working on the restoration, basically he said it's like working on a 30,000 piece jigsaw puzzle where half the pieces are broken and missing. Now, the Parthenon does have some Ionic elements too. Inside, there are 4 Ionic columns, and the interior friezes are also done in the Ionic style. The Parthenon was more lavishly decorated than any temple that came before it. There are 92 Doric metopes, and the interior Ionic frieze is 524 feet long. And there are dozens of statues in both pediments. Probably the grandest figure in the Parthenon was what's called the Athena Parthenon, circa 438 BCE. Now, this was a 38-foot tall gold and ivory statue. The original has been lost, but we have many descriptions of it from the works of various Greek authors. She was fully armed with a shield, spear, and helmet, and in her right hand you can see she's actually holding the personification of victory, or Nike. So Nike was the female personification for victory, meaning takes this abstract idea, this intangible idea of victory, and gives it a human form. And that's what's called Nike. There's a reason why the athletic company Nike chose its name. It literally means victory. And so she's holding this in her hand. And this would represent the Greek win over the Persians. Her shield, it has high reliefs on both the front and the back. The front shows the Greeks fighting the Amazons. The back is the fight of the gods fighting the giants. And again, this is a metaphor of a triumph of order over chaos, of civilization over barbarianism, and more specifically of Athens over Persia. Now, we mentioned there are the 92 Doric metopes. This is an example of the top left of one, and this is circa 477 to 438 BCE. It's marble. And again, these different metopes show different battle scenes, and this again is a reference for the Greek and Persian battle. Now, in the pediments, we have in the west pediment, right, these are both fitting for a temple to Athena. The west pediment shows the birth of Athena. In the east pediment shows the battle between Athena and Poseidon over who would become the city's patron deity. Obviously, Athena won. But what's interesting in this is the Athenians themselves, right, the people who lived in Athens, are the ones sitting in judgment. And this again shows how they thought of themselves, this kind of arrogance, this judging of the gods, that they are going to choose which one will be their god. The forms show that the sculptors understood the surface appearance of human anatomy and how muscles and bones make the body move. So again, our works are becoming more realistic. The forms are very lifelike, and also you can see from the middle and the bottom images here this manipulation of fabric and clothing. It at once reveals the form and also conceals the form. And then looking more specifically at the Ionic friezes on the interior, this shows the Pantheistic festival procession that took place every 4 years. And here what's interesting is, again, the Athenians have placed themselves in the procession. No other Greek temple had ever featured a human event in its decorations. Again, showing how the Athenian people thought of themselves. Literally, they placed them on themselves the same level as the gods. Now, the procession would start at the Diplon Gate and it ended at the Acropolis. The procession begins on the west side and it ends at the center of the east frieze. Also, what's interesting within this, the gods themselves are spectators. They're not judges or not even participants. I think your book makes reference to, we see Aphrodite and her young son Eros, where she's kind of pointing like, hey, look, like a parent would today, watching a parade. And so the gods, again, aren't these active participants. The Parthenon celebrates the greatness of Athens and the Athenians as much as it honored Athena. The other buildings are talked about in more detail in your text. I'm not going to go over it in the lecture, so please make sure you are looking that over in the text. All right, briefly, we are going to look at painting during this time. Now, unfortunately, most of the painting from the early classical period has been lost. We know there were these large wood panels that were painted, and they were displayed in public buildings, but because of decay and over time, we don't have any that remain. However, the vase painting of the time gives us an illusion of what some of these might have looked like. And the vase painting of the time used what's called a white ground painting technique. Now, this uses a chalky white slip to provide a background for the paintings. And basically, it's a variation of the red figure technique that we've already talked about. So what happens is the painter covers the pot with a fine slip of white clay, then applies the black glaze to outline the figures, and then they can use other diluted colors such as brown, purple, red, and white to color them. And then they would fire them in the kiln. Other colors could then be used like yellow, but they had not figured out at the time how to get these colors to last or to stay true to their color before the firing, so that's why they were added afterwards. And this white ground painting technique became popular toward the middle of the 5th century BCE. Also, what's interesting during this time period is different vase works are beginning to show figures on different levels, not just in the single bands, and we have different views and also landscape elements put into the works. All right, now we're going to move to the late classical period. And so what happens is we have the Peloponnesian War. The Peloponnesian War led to Athens finally being defeated by Sparta, 431 to 404 BCE. Sparta then controlled Greece, and then eventually Thebes controlled Greece, but neither did very well. In 338 BCE, the Greeks were actually defeated by the Macedonian king Philip II. He was then assassinated in 336, and his son, Alexander III, takes over. Alexander III becomes known as Alexander the Great. His reign was 336 to 323 BCE. He overthrew the Persian Empire, had control of parts of Egypt, and even expanded the empire to reach India. Now, during this time period, this time period of kind of political turmoil, Greek art reflected these troubled times. No longer was it focused on the ideal and mathematical harmony of the early classical period. Now we're seeing disillusionment and alienation in the works. And also we're seeing more of a shift to a focus on the individual and showing real world experiences that the everyday person would have. And we see this reflected again in the artworks. So first we're going to look at sculpture. The first sculptor we're going to look at is Praxiteles, and both of these works here are attributed to him. He was one of the 3 great sculptors of the late classical period. Now, his figures are still beautiful, but they become more human and approachable, and they're also doing everyday things. Many of his figures also had this shallow S curve to their form, making them again a little more natural and a little softer, if you will. The first example is on the left. This is Aphrodite of Neos. Again, this is a Roman copy of marble, circa 350-340 BCE, 6 feet 8 inches. Now, this work actually made him famous. Why? First off, it's showing the goddess nude. If you remember earlier, we talked about male forms were often shown nude, but not the female forms. In female forms, nudity was rare, especially nudity of a goddess. However, here he shows her nude. Now, this, though, is not erotic, right? It's not meant to be sexual. She's also not cold and remote. She has this slight smile, and we get this sensuous nature to her, right? Not erotic or sexual, but sensuous, making her appear, more approachable, more human, if you will. And she's also doing something, very ordinary. She's disrobed because she's literally getting ready to step into her bath. Now, Praxiteles was known for his ability to transform marble into this soft and radiant flesh. We see this again in the other work here. This is Hermes and the infant Dionysus. And again, this is copy of the marble, circa 340 BCE. Now, this has been attributed to Praxiteles, but it is actually thought this was probably done by maybe a son or a grandson of his who he had trained. And so here we have this moment between father and son. Hermes and his son Dionysus are resting on their journey. And we have to remember, right, these are gods. But what we see here is we see a moment that happens, repeatedly in daily life. This tender interaction between a father and a son. However, this is not something that was really shown in art before the 4th century BCE. And so again, Hermes would have in his right arm, he's trying to feed his son grapes that's been broken off. But it's kind of this tender moment. Again, here too, you can see that slight S curve to the body. The flesh seems soft and approachable. And again, it's showing these gods in everyday situations, right? Something that would happen daily in the real world. All right, the second of the 3 great sculptors of the time is Scopas. He was an architect and a sculptor. However, unfortunately, no of his statues remain. Now, his works were known for their intense emotionalism in them, and we can see that in a work of his that does remain. This is the Ilios stele, 340 to 330 BCE. It is a marble, and it's 5 feet 6 inches high. Now, this stele was to basically mourn the deceased. And in this one, the deceased is actually the young hunter, who was the larger figure on the left. And here we show this clear distinction between the living and the dead. So there's either his younger brother or maybe his son, if you look in the bottom left, is sobbing. Next to him, like the dog is even sad, right? The dog's head is hanging down. And then we see the older father on the right, looking at the young hunter as if, thinking about like, well, why my young and healthy son, why is he dead? And, I'm older and yet I survive. And more than anything in this that gets the emotion is the hunter is looking directly at the viewer. And so he's inviting sympathy and he's creating an emotional connection between himself and the viewer. And again, this was something that was not done until this time period. All right, and then the last of the 3 great sculptors of this time is Lysippus. He was actually chosen by Alexander the Great to make his portrait, and he said only he could do it so well that only he could create images of Alexander. However, as your book has said, since then, many works have been created showing Alexander the Great, and since there's so many and they're varied, we really aren't 100% sure what Alexander the Great looked like. Unfortunately, the works by Lysippus have been lost. Now, what's interesting is Lysippus introduced a new canon of proportions. Remember when we looked at early classical, right? That ideal proportions, the mathematical harmony. Well, in his works, the bodies were more slender, and the heads were roughly 1/8 the height of the body, not 1/7 as had been used. Also, the works we know now are, again, Roman copies. And he wanted the viewer to not just look at the work from the front. He wanted the viewer to experience the work from several angles. And so it's meant for you to walk around these works to get the full idea. And so the left is this athlete again, and he's scraping off the wax that would have been used after he exercised. But more so than that, on the right, this is called Weary Heracles, circa 320. The original was bronze. This is a marble. And this is actually 10 feet 5 inches in height. And again, this is humanizing the gods. And what we're looking at here is Heracles is exhausted and dejected after his labors. And literally, right, even though we see his massive muscles and his form, he's actually depending on his club to keep him upright. And this again shows Lysippus' rejection of stability and balance in works. Literally, right, Heracles needs the club to remain up. Also, in his right arm and his right hand, he's holding the golden apple from one of the tasks, and it's behind his back. So again, this is encouraging the viewer to walk around the work. But you can see in these works by these artists, right, this drastic change from the early classical period. That again, we're not worried with showing this idealized perfection and this mathematical harmony. Now, also in architecture in the late classical period, this is a time again of innovation and experimentation. The theater at Epidauros is one of the examples of this. Now, when we think of Greek drama and the Greek plays, these weren't like plays like we would see, every day or just as entertainment, right? I'm recording this in summer, and Shakespeare in the Park is happening in Central Park, and that's for purely entertainment reasons. That's not what Greek drama was. Greek drama was closely associated with religious rites. Now the theater that we're looking at, this is considered the finest theater in Greece, and it was designed by Polyclitus the Younger. And so this might have been a distant relationship of the early Polyclitus that we discussed. Now the theater itself is 387 feet in diameter. It has 55 rows of seats, and it could hold about 12,000 spectators at once. The circular patch where the actors perform became known as the orchestra. Orchestra literally means dancing place. And then spectators sat on a slope overlooking the orchestra, and it's called the theatron, or the place of seeing. And builders would always, when they would make these amphitheaters or theaters, they would always situate them on a hillside, the auditorium on the hillside, so the spectators could sit and look down onto the action. Also, another interesting development at this time, it's what's called the Corinthian Capitals, and this is the third Greek architectural order. We've already talked about the Doric and the Ionic. Well, this is the Corinthian. This was created by the sculptor Kyleticus during the second half of the 5th century BCE. However, they actually did not become popular until the Hellenistic period. Now, they are more ornate than both the Doric and the Ionic capitals. And what they have on them, is how you can tell them apart, is they have a row of acanthus leaves, and from that other plants and flowers can emerge. And these were all wrapped around a bell-shaped acneus. And you can see that in the image here. So much more decorative in nature. And the designers actually, especially builders, liked these more because since all four sides are roughly the same in appearance, it solves some of the issues builders had been having trying to use Doric and Ionic capitals, especially the Ionic with the votives, all right, where the scroll would face one way or the other. Well, what do you do when you get to the corners? So Corinthian capitals kind of solved that problem. All right, now we're going to move on to our last time period in ancient Greece, and this is what's known as the Hellenistic period. Now, the Hellenistic period started with the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BCE, and it lasted until 30 BCE with the defeat and deaths of Cleopatra and Mark Antony. Now, the cultural centers of the time were what were considered court cities of Greek kings who prided themselves on their libraries, art collections, scientific enterprises, their skills as critics and connoisseurs. So no longer just belonging to a city-state, but it was this idea of being a cosmopolitan civilization. Cosmopolitan literally means citizen of the world. Now, the architecture of the time, it had a very grandiose scale, and again, it was widely diverse. And so what we're going to just look at for this part is what's called the stoas. And these were probably some of the most important and most versatile parts of the Greek cities. Now, the stoa, or covered colonnade, or porticos, you can see shown here. And what these were is basically they're kind of these covered outside areas, and they would house shops and civic offices. They were staples of the late classical and the Hellenistic cities. And in fact, the Stoic school of Greek philosophy met in one of these, and so it took its name from the building. And what we're looking at here is we're looking at the reconstructed Stoa of Attalus II, circa 150 BCE. Now this is 2 stories. Each story has 21 shops opening onto the colonnades. The first floor has Doric columns, which you can see here. The second floor, if you zoom in, you can see them, has Ionic columns. Now, this wasn't increasingly common in the Hellenistic period, and it wasn't really to pay homage to the past orders, but it was more of this desire for variety and decorative effects. All right, and then we're going to look at the Altar of Zeus at Pergamon, 175 BCE. Now, this is the most famous Hellenistic sculptural ensemble. It has a frieze that is almost 400 feet long, populated with hundreds of larger-than-life figures. The subject is the battle of Zeus and the gods against the giants, and it shows also the current king's victory, but again establishes a connections to Athens and the Parthenon, which was already respected as a classical monument. What we're looking at here, the figure of Athena in the frieze closely resembles the Athena in the Parthenon's east pediment, again showing this link between the two. Now, the frieze has an emotional intensity that has not been seen before. The image that we're looking at here, literally, we are having, Athena. She's grabbing the head of one of the giants. Rhea, the earth goddess, mother of the giants, is coming from the bottom and seeing this. Victory, winged Victory, is flying in and literally ready to crown Athena the victor. And so throughout the frieze, there's this emotional intensity that we had not seen before. There's literally battle everywhere. There are swift movements, vicious movements, swirling clothing, vivid depictions of death and dying. And actually, some art historians call it Baroque in style, and this is actually a reference to the 17th century Italian style, the Baroque style. And that style encompasses emotion, drama, and opulence throughout the works. Now we're going to see this continue in the statuary of the time. So Hellenistic sculptures take the late classical works even further in terms of style and the range of subjects depicted. They rejected the concept of a state of ideally proportioned perfection that was self-contained on a bare pedestal. They rejected that and said, no, that is not what the artworks are going to be. And the works often interacted with their environment and appeared as living, breathing, and intensely emotive humans, whether they were human or divine. So we saw this human emotive presence in the works. You can see that in the work shown here. The one on the left is the Nike of Samarith, circa 190 BCE, and it's marble 8 feet 1 inch high. And so what's happening in this moment is the winged Victory has just landed on the prow of a Greek warship. So you can see that here, that literally she's standing on the front of the ship. And she's there to declare victory. Now she's still in motion, it's like she just landed. Her wings are still beating, and you can sense the movement of the ship, right? The wind pushes her clothes back, right? They're pulled back. So imagine standing at the front of a ship and that wind pushing back on you. That's shown within the work. And then even more so, the original work was actually part of a fountain. So the illusion of the ship goes even further with the water hitting the prow of the ship. Also, another change in works is shown in the middle work here. And this is the famous Venus de Milo, circa 150 to 125 BCE, made of marble, 6 feet 7 inches in height. The sculptor was Alexandros of Antioch on the Meander. And often what we're going to see, we talked about a minute ago, how Aphrodite, it was shocking the first time to see her not dressed. Well, what happens is over time is often we would see Aphrodite undressed. However, what happens is we're starting now to see this exploration of eroticism of the nude female form. In her left hand, it's preserved separately, She's actually holding the apple that Paris awarded her as the Judgment of Paris. The Judgment of Paris is basically where the human Paris had to decide which of the goddesses, the apple says, to the fairest. And Athena, Hera, and Aphrodite all claimed it belonged to them. And they wanted Zeus to decide. And Zeus, being the smart god he was like, I'm not getting in this, right? It was between his wife and two of his daughters. And so Paris, the mortal, was seen as a fair person. And so he was the one who was to judge and give the apple to the fairest. Basically, everybody bribed him. Aphrodite bribed him with the most beautiful woman in the world, and he awarded her the apple. The most beautiful woman in the world, though, was Helen of Sparta, who was already married to Menelaus. And so Paris stole her away, took her back to his hometown of Troy. Well, the Greeks formed together to go get her. Helen of Sparta becomes Helen of Troy, the face that launched 1,000 ships. And that's the epic battle of the Trojan War, where the Greeks and the Trojans fight, are because of the Judgment of Paris. So anyway, she would have the apple in her left hand. Now, this work, why it's so radically different, is that it's definitely playing up on eroticism and the sexuality of the figure. The sculptor intentionally designed the work to tease the spectator. It instills a sense of sexuality in her. And other Hellenistic sculptors, also, especially when creating works for private patrons, went even further in depicting the goddess of love as an object of sexual desire. And you can see an example of that on the right. Also, another work that focuses on this eroticism and sexuality. This is the Barberini Faun, circa 230 to 200 BCE, marble, 7 feet 1 inch. Now, it's called this because Cardinal Francisco Barberini acquired it and had Bernini, one of the great Italian Baroque sculptors, restore it for him. And so again, Hellenistic sculptors often showed sleeping figures in their works, and that's what we see here. Here we have a drunken satyr, which is a semi-human follower of Dionysus, and we see him sleeping, like he's kind of passed out in a drunken slumber. However, it's very openly erotic. Nude men had been shown for hundreds of years, but not usually with this sexuality. Right here we see these wantonly spread legs drawing focus to his genitalia, and it's meant to be openly erotic. Homosexuality was common in the male world of ancient Greece, so when sculptors started making figures more erotic and sexual, they did so to both the male and the female forms. And your book makes mention that the male gaze in ancient Greece was not just on the female form. Now, sculptors in the Hellenistic period did not abandon all traditional themes, but they did put their own spin on them, and that's what we see in the figure on the right. This is the defeated boxer, circa 100 to 50 BCE, bronze, and it's 4 feet 2 inches. So again, here we see the Greek athlete, but it's not that hero, right? It's not that ideal form that we had seen before. Here we have this boxer who's been heavily battered, he's defeated, he's a veteran, he's older, and we see him still bleeding. He's got a broken nose, broken teeth, cauliflower ears. And so with this, right, so we're seeing that athletic form, but again, it's almost appeal more to our emotions, that we're to look at this and you'll understand and feel his sadness, feel his defeat. And so again, this appeals not to the intellect, but to the emotions. Often sculptures would also focus on people who had not been portrayed before in life-size works. This would include the old, the ugly, different body types, people from other places. And also they redefined at this point what it meant by a portrait. And so instead of just trying to show, the idealized form, during the Hellenistic period, sculptors and artists wanted to create works that showed what the sitter actually looked like and also to capture the essence of their personalities. So it wasn't just enough to show what they looked like, they also wanted to show who they are. Also, we can see more of this dramatic emotion in works such as this one. This one's called Laocoon and His Sons, circa early 1st century CE. It's a marble. It's 7 feet 10.5 inches high. And again, your textbook talks about, this is kind of that transition from Greece to Rome. In fact, Greece became a Roman province in 146 BCE. And so some works were created just to help fulfill this Roman desire for Greek works. But here again, in Laocoon and His Sons, we see that highly emotional Hellenistic style. Again, the forms are accurately shown. And what this actually also has to go with the Trojan War. And what happens is, near the end of the Trojan War, the Greeks basically create a votive offering to the Trojans. They build the giant Trojan horse, and they hide within it different Greek warriors. And so basically, and they sailed some of the ships off, basically it looked like they left. And the people of Troy thought, wow, the Greeks left. They surrendered and they left us this great horse. This 10-year-long war is finally done. However, Laocoon did not believe it, and he knew it was a trap. And this is that famous, his famous line of "Beware of Greeks." I don't trust Greeks, even those bestowing gifts. And so he was told by the gods not to warn the people of Troy that it was a trap. Well, he did. And so because of that, his punishment is that he and his sons were actually killed and drowned by the sea serpents. And this is that moment. You can see, the anguish. That's not just him that's dying, but his sons are being drowned and torn apart by the serpents also. So you again see this movement, this drama, the anguish, right? On one of his left hip, you can see one of the snakes or serpents literally is biting him. So again, this is showing all of that emotion, that action, that drama that represents the Hellenistic style. And so to conclude, again, Greece becomes a Roman province in 146 BCE. And if Greece claims to be the inventor of the European spirit, we're going to see in the upcoming chapters that Rome was actually its propagator and amplifier. And that's what we'll move on in our next few chapters.